The arrogant alien girl. Syrex stood tall in the training hall, her sharp red eyes scanning the room with boredom. She was a warrior from the Dravani Empire, a race known for their unmatched strength and speed. Her kind had conquered planets, crushed enemies, and stood at the top of the galaxy's food chain. To her, humans were nothing but weaklings, fragile creatures who depended too much on their weapons and tricks. And yet here she was, assigned to train under a human. Syrex clenched her fists as she looked at Captain Jack Carter, the man she was supposed to learn from. He was not impressive. Shorter than her, with a strong but lean build, brown hair, and a scar running down his left cheek. His uniform was simple, black combat gear with no fancy decorations. Nothing about him screamed warrior to her. Jack stood with his arms crossed, his expression calm. He had faced aliens before, seen their arrogance, and he knew how this would go. Syrex smirked, stepping forward. "Is this a joke?" she said, her voice full of amusement. "They sent me to train under a human. What can you possibly teach me?" Jack didn't react. "We'll see," he said simply. "Show me what you've got." Syrex laughed. "Fine. Try to keep up." She moved fast, faster than any human could react. At least, that's what she thought. With a blur of motion, she lunged at Jack, aiming a strike straight at his chest. She expected him to be thrown across the room, gasping for air. But something went wrong. Jack wasn't there. At the last second, he shifted to the side. Not with speed, but with precision. His movement was smooth, calculated. Syrex's punch hit nothing but air, and before she could react, Jack's foot swept under her leg. She stumbled. A Dravani warrior never stumbled. The other alien trainees watching the fight snickered. Syrex's face burned with embarrassment. She recovered quickly, growling. "Lucky move." Jack shrugged. "Try again." This time, she went all out. She threw a series of powerful strikes, fists, elbows, even a quick kick aimed at his ribs. Each attack was fast and deadly, meant to end the fight in seconds. But Jack dodged them all with ease. He wasn't faster than her. He was just smarter. He didn't waste energy. He saw every move before she made it. He was reading her. Syrex growled in frustration. She launched herself forward, using her full strength. This time, Jack didn't move away. Instead, he stepped in. Before she could react, he caught her wrist. And then, in one swift motion, he twisted it and threw her to the ground. Thude. The hall fell silent. Syrex lay on the floor, gasping. What just happened? Jack stood over her, his face calm as ever. He hadn't even broken a sweat. "You rely too much on power," he said. "But power without control is useless." Syrex's hands shook as she pushed herself up. Her pride burned more than her body. The Dravani soldiers in the room chuckled. She had lost. To a human. She glared at Jack. "You cheated." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" He stepped back, giving her space. "If this was a real fight, you'd be dead. Strength alone doesn't win wars. Strategy does." Syrex's fists clenched. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say something, anything, to prove she wasn't weak. But she had no words. Jack turned to the rest of the trainees. Lesson 1. Never underestimate an enemy. Your ego will get you killed faster than any weapon. Syrex's heart pounded. She had spent her whole life believing Dravani warriors were the strongest in the galaxy. Now, for the first time, she felt doubt. Jack started walking away. Before he left the hall, he paused and glanced back at her. "Tomorrow, we try again. Maybe this time, you'll actually learn something." Syrex stayed on the ground, staring at the spot where he had stood. For the first time in her life, she felt something strange. Fear. First, humiliation. Syrex stormed out of the training hall, fists clenched so tightly that her claws dug into her own palms. She had never felt this before. Shame. Humiliation. Rage. It burned inside her like a wildfire, and she had no idea how to put it out. She had fought thousands of battles. She had broken bones, torn through enemies, and crushed anyone who stood in her way. No one had ever defeated her so easily. And yet, that human had made her look like a fool. She replayed the fight in her mind, trying to find the moment she had lost control. Jack Carter had not used brute force. He had not relied on speed. He had done something else, something she did not understand. He had read her, predicted her moves before she even made them. He had been 2 steps ahead the entire time. She growled, slamming her fist against the cold metal wall of the barracks. The impact left a dent, but it did nothing to cool the anger boiling in her veins. The other Dravani soldiers had seen her fall. They had laughed. They had whispered behind her back as she walked out of the hall. She would not accept this. She could not accept this. She had to prove herself. The next challenge. The next day, Syrinx arrived at the training grounds early. She had spent the entire night running battle simulations in her mind. If she could just figure out how Jack fought, she could counter him. This time, she would not lose. The other trainees gathered around as Jack entered. He walked in calmly, the same unreadable look on his face. He wasn't tense. He wasn't wary. It was as if their last fight had meant nothing to him. That made her anger rise again. Syrinx stepped forward. "I demand a rematch." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Oh." The trainees muttered amongst themselves. Some chuckled. Others were curious. Would she lose again? Jack sighed and set his gear down. "All right. Show me what you've learned." Syrinx didn't hesitate. This time, she didn't go straight for an attack. She circled him, analyzing his stance, searching for an opening. She had observed. She had calculated. She would not make the same mistake twice. Then she struck. Her movement was sharp, precise, far better than yesterday. She feinted left, but at the last second, she twisted right and launched a heavy knee toward his ribs. Jack didn't dodge. Instead, he caught her knee with both hands. The impact sent a small shockwave through the ground, but Jack held firm. Syrinx's eyes widened. How was he this strong? Before she could react, he shifted his grip, twisted her leg, and sent her crashing onto her back harder than before. Thuti. The watching trainees gasped. Some even flinched. Syrinx couldn't move. Her entire body ached from the impact. Jack stood over her, arms crossed. "You improved," he said, "but you still don't understand." Syrinx struggled to push herself up. She refused to stay down. But Jack pressed his boot against her chest, pinning her. "Do you know why you lost again?" Jack asked. Syrinx's breath was ragged. "Because you cheated," she hissed. Jack sighed. Wrong answer. He removed his foot and stepped back, giving her space to stand. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up. Jack's voice remained calm. "You think power is everything. You think strength wins fights. That's why you lost." Syrinx's jaw tightened. "Then what wins fights?" Jack smirked. "Control, experience, patience. Things you don't have." The Dravani soldiers whispered again. Syrinx's humiliation deepened. She felt their eyes on her, some mocking, some curious. Jack turned away as if he had already forgotten about her. "Get some rest, warrior. You're going to need it." Syrinx trembled with rage. She had lost twice. She had never lost before. Her pride was shattered. But deep inside, a small voice whispered a thought she didn't want to hear. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I don't know as much as I thought." And that terrified her. The punishment mission. Syrinx sat alone in the dimly lit barracks, her fists clenched on her lap. The echoes of her failures haunted her. Twice she had faced Jack Carter, and twice she had been humiliated. Her pride, once unshakable, now felt like cracked glass ready to shatter. She could still hear the whispers of the other Dravani soldiers. The great Syrinx, brought down by a human. Maybe she's not as strong as she claims. Maybe she's not strong at all. Her claws scraped against the metal bench, It wasn't just about pride anymore. She had something to prove, not just to them, but to herself. She would not be weak. She would not be humiliated again. The door slid open with a sharp hiss, and her commanding officer, General Crows, entered. His tall, armored frame radiated authority. His dark crimson eyes locked onto Syrinx with cold amusement. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice like steel, "you will prove your worth." Syrinx straightened. "How?" Crows smirked. "A combat mission. Dangerous. Perhaps fatal." Syrinx's muscles tensed. A mission. She had expected more training, more meaningless drills. But this was a real fight. This was her chance. "I accept." Crows chuckled. "You have no choice." He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Carter will be leading." Syrinx's heart stopped for a brief second. Jack Carter. Again. Her claws dug deeper into her palms, but she said nothing. She wouldn't lose this time. The mission begins. The transport ship rumbled as it exited the cruiser's docking bay. Syrinx sat across from Jack, her arms crossed, her expression hard. Around them, other soldiers prepped their weapons. The atmosphere was tense. Jack barely acknowledged her. He simply checked his rifle, his face unreadable. Syrinx hated that. She wanted him to look at her. She wanted him to recognize that she wasn't the same warrior he had beaten before. The mission briefing had been simple. A remote mining outpost had gone silent. No distress signals, no signs of life. It could be an ambush. It could be worse. The ship's comms crackled. Approaching drop zone. 5 minutes. Jack stood. "All right, listen up. We go in, we secure the outpost, and we get out. Stay sharp. We don't know what's down there." Syrinx scoffed. "You sound nervous, human." Jack finally met her gaze. "I'm always cautious before a fight." His words unsettled her. Was he truly cautious, or was he just calculating, like before? The ship jolted as it landed. The doors hissed open, revealing darkness. The outpost was dead. No lights, no movement, just silence. The squad moved forward, weapons ready. Jack took point, his rifle raised. Syrinx followed close behind. The air smelled wrong. She sniffed, her sharp senses picking up traces of something metallic. Blood. They found the first bodies near the outpost entrance. Humans and Dravani soldiers, torn apart. The squad tensed. Jack crouched near one of the corpses. No energy burns, no bullet wounds. His voice was calm, but his grip on his rifle tightened. Syrinx frowned. What killed them? The answer came a second later. The attack. The shadows moved. Fast. Something big slammed into the soldier on Syrinx's left, dragging him into the darkness before he could even scream. Gunfire erupted. The squad opened fire, but their bullets hit nothing. The enemy was too fast, too precise. Syrinx barely had time to react before something lunged at her. She dodged at the last second, rolling away as clawed limbs slashed through the air where she had stood. The creature was massive, 7 feet tall, sleek, with black exoskeleton armor. Its glowing red eyes locked onto her, intelligent and hungry. Syrinx snarled in charge, slamming her fist into its chest. It didn't even flinch. Then it hit back. Syrinx barely had time to react before she was thrown across the outpost wall. She hit the metal with a sickening crunch, pain exploding through her ribs. She gasped, trying to stand. Too fast, too strong. Jack's voice cut through the chaos. Fall back. Regroup inside. The remaining soldiers retreated toward the outpost, firing blindly. Syrinx stumbled after them, her body aching. As the doors slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside, Syrinx's breathing was heavy. She had never been thrown like that before. She looked up at Jack, who was already securing the entrance. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't afraid. She hated that. She hated that he was still in control. The first fear. Inside, the squad gathered, their numbers smaller. Jack turned to her. "Now do you get it?" Syrinx scowled. "Get what?" Jack gestured to the bodies. "Power doesn't mean anything if you don't know how to use it. Those things are faster, stronger, and they don't care how tough you are. You rush in blind, you die." Syrinx didn't answer. She was still trying to ignore the pain in her ribs. But deep inside, something uncomfortable settled in her chest. Fear. She had never been afraid before. Jack sighed. "Stay close. Don't do anything stupid." Syrinx glared at him, but said nothing. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she could win. And that was the worst feeling of all. The rescue and the lesson. Syrinx's breathing was ragged. The pounding in her chest wasn't from exhaustion. It was something worse. Something she refused to name. Fear. She pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the abandoned outpost, her claws trembling slightly. Outside, in the darkness beyond the reinforced doors, they were waiting. The creatures. The things that had slaughtered the first team like they were nothing. The squad was down to 5. 5 survivors from an elite team. And she was among them. Not because of her strength, not because of her speed, but because Jack Carter had ordered the retreat. The thought made her stomach twist. She hated him. She hated how calm he was. She hated how he hadn't panicked, how he had taken control while everyone else froze. She hated that, without him, she would be dead. Jack was already at work, moving methodically through the outpost control panels, searching for power. The emergency lights flickered a dull red glow across the ruined hallways, casting shadows that made everyone flinch. "We need eyes," Jack muttered. "Syrinx, on me." Syrinx stiffened. She didn't like being ordered around, but she pushed off the wall and followed. They reached a broken security terminal. Jack tapped at the controls, and the screen flickered to life. The external cameras came online. Syrinx immediately regretted looking. The creatures were everywhere. They moved like shadows, blending into the ruined structures, creeping along the walls, their razor-sharp claws leaving deep gouges in the metal. Their glowing red eyes flickered in the darkness, scanning for weaknesses, hunting, waiting. They weren't just beasts. They were thinking. Syrinx swallowed hard. Jack exhaled sharply, his face unreadable. He tapped his communicator. "HQ, do you read? We got hostiles, unknown species. Squad is compromised. Requesting immediate extraction." Silence. Then signals jammed. Jack clenched his jaw. "Of course it is." Syrinx's temper finally snapped. "You act like you expected this." Jack glanced at her, calm as ever. "Because I did." Syrinx growled. "We need to fight back. Open the doors. I'll rip them apart." "No." Jack's voice was sharp, cutting through her rage. "You charge out there, you die. Simple as that." Syrinx bared her fangs. "You think I'm weak." Jack leaned in slightly, his voice low. "I think you're reckless, and I don't have time to babysit you." Syrinx's hands curled into fists. He was insulting her, again. But before she could lash out, before she could argue, the creatures attacked. The invasion. The metal doors shrieked as something slammed against them. Then again. Then again. Dents appeared, deep claw marks tearing through the reinforced steel. The squad backed away, rifles raised. Syrinx didn't hesitate. She drew her blade, her pulse pounding. The next impact sent the entire door flying inward. The creatures swarmed. The first soldier barely had time to scream before he was ripped in half. Gunfire erupted. The creatures moved like blurs, their armor like skin deflecting most of the shots. Syrinx leaped forward, slicing clean through one's arm with her blade. It screeched, its black blood splattering against the walls. Another lunged at her from behind. Jack intercepted it. He caught the monster's head and shoved his knife straight through its eye. Syrinx's breath hitched. She hadn't even seen it coming. Jack had. He moved with precision, dodging attacks with minimal effort, putting down enemies with cold efficiency. He wasn't fighting like a brute. He wasn't fighting like her. He was surviving. And she realized this wasn't a battle. This was a hunt. And they were the prey. The escape plan. Move. Back to the elevator. Jack barked. Syrinx hesitated. Her instincts told her to stand and fight. She could still win. She could still. Jack grabbed her wrist. Now. Syrinx had never been dragged in her life. The humiliation burned hot in her chest, but she had no choice. They sprinted through the ruined outpost, creatures clawing after them. The elevator shaft was just ahead. Jack slammed his fist against the controls. Nothing. Manual override, he shouted. Syrinx's sharp eyes scanned the room. A lever. Emergency access. There. She lunged for it, yanking it down. The elevator rumbled to life. But the creatures were right behind them. Jack fired his last rounds, but one of the monsters was too fast. It dodged, launching itself at him. Syrinx didn't think. She moved. She tackled Jack out of the way, taking the hit herself. The force sent her crashing into the elevator wall. Claws raked across her side, hot pain slicing deep. She snarled, grabbing the beast's throat and slamming it against the metal. Jack was already moving. He grabbed his knife and buried it into the creature's skull. It went limp. The elevator doors slid shut just as the remaining creatures reached them. Their furious screeches echoed as the lift began its slow ascent. Syrinx slid down the wall, breathing hard. Blood dripped from her wound. Jack crouched beside her, assessing the damage. "You'll live." Syrinx let out a breathless laugh. "Don't sound so disappointed, human." Jack smirked. That was reckless. She expected more criticism. Another lecture. Instead, Jack held out his hand. She stared at it. Then, reluctantly, she took it. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about proving her strength. For the first time, she had fought beside him, not against him. And she realized something that made her stomach turn. Jack Carter was not just a human. He was a survivor, a warrior, a leader. And for the first time, she respected him. The betrayal and the human rage. The elevator rumbled as it climbed higher, its ancient gears grinding against time-worn metal. The dim emergency lights cast flickering shadows across the blood-splattered walls. The air was thick with the scent of burnt plasma, torn flesh, and the iron tang of Syrinx's own blood. She winced as she pressed a hand against her wounded side. It wasn't lethal, but it burned, and she hated that she had been wounded at all. Across from her, Jack Carter was watching her. His brown eyes were sharp, calculating. Not concerned, not afraid, just analyzing. Syrinx had fought with the best warriors in the galaxy. She had crushed enemies with her bare hands. But never, never had she fought beside someone like him. And for the first time, she was beginning to understand why humans were feared. Jack wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest. But he never stopped thinking, never stopped adapting. While she had been driven by instinct, by anger, by pride, he had been playing a different game entirely. A game that he was winning. She hated that. She respected it. The elevator shuddered to a stop, breaking the silence. Jack was the first to move. "We're not safe yet." Syrinx stood, ignoring the pain. "Then let's finish this." The doors hissed open. The ambush. The upper platform overlooked the ruins of the outpost. Smoke curled into the air, blending with the stars above. Their transport ship sat in the distance, its engines still warm, ready for takeoff. For the first time, Syrinx felt something close to relief. They had made it. Then she heard it. The gun clicking behind them. Jack reacted first. His pistol was up in an instant. Syrinx turned, her muscles tensing. General Crows stood at the landing pad, surrounded by a squad of Dravani soldiers. Their weapons were aimed directly at Jack and Syrinx. Her blood ran cold. "General," she said, confused. "What is this?" Crows smiled. "It's called strategy, Syrinx." Jack's expression didn't change. His gun stayed raised, steady. "You left us down there to die." Crows shrugged. "And yet you survived. I should have expected that from you, human." Syrinx stepped forward. "You knew those things were here." Krause's smirk widened. "Of course. We needed to know their capabilities, their weaknesses, and more importantly, we needed to know your weaknesses." Syrinx's claws curled into fists. "You sent us on a suicide mission." "Correction," Crows said smoothly. "I sent him on a suicide mission." His gaze flicked to Jack. "But you, Syrinx, you were the real test. I wanted to see how long you'd survive before breaking." Syrinx's heart pounded. He had used her. He had wanted her to fail. She had spent her whole life serving the Dravani Empire, proving her strength, proving her loyalty. And yet when the moment had come, her own commander had thrown her away like nothing. She had expected betrayal from an enemy, not from her own kind. Beside her, Jack hadn't moved. Syrinx risked a glance at him. His expression was calm, unreadable. And then she noticed his grip on his gun had tightened. His shoulders had tensed. She had seen Jack in battle. She had seen him fight those creatures with terrifying precision. But she had never seen him angry. Until now. The human rage. Jack lowered his pistol slightly. Not in surrender, but in preparation. Syrinx had seen it before. The stance of someone ready to kill. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Jack said. His voice was quiet, steady, dangerous. Crows chuckled. "Oh, Carter, I don't need to walk away. You, on the other hand." He lifted his hand. "Kill him." The Dravani soldiers raised their rifles. Syrinx moved before she even thought. Her instincts screamed at her, not to fight Crows, but to protect Jack. She lashed out, grabbing the nearest soldier and snapping his arm backward with a sickening crack. He screamed, his rifle clattering to the ground. Jack exploded into motion. He fired 3 shots. Headshots. Clean. Perfect. The landing pad erupted into chaos. Syrinx was faster than the soldiers. She slammed into 2 at once, sending them sprawling. Jack was already moving, weaving between enemies, his knife flashing in the dim light. Syrinx barely had time to process it. Jack fought differently now. Before, he had been careful, controlled. Now he was ruthless, precise, deadly. This wasn't the soldier she had sparred with. This was something else. This was a human in full rage. Within seconds, half the squad was dead. Syrinx turned to Crows, her fangs bared. "You used me," she growled. "You thought I was weak." Crows sneered. "You are weak. You fought beside a human." Syrinx didn't hesitate. She hit him. Her fist connected with Crow's jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. He choked on blood, his crimson eyes wide with shock. Syrinx grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground. "You're wrong," she snarled. "I didn't fight beside a human. I fought beside a warrior." Crow struggled, gasping for breath. His soldiers were dead. His plan had failed. Jack stood beside her, wiping blood from his knife. He didn't stop her. Syrinx made her decision. She let Crows fall. She turned her back on him. Jack glanced at her. "You sure about that?" She exhaled. "He's not worth it." Jack smirked. "You're learning." The sound of approaching ships filled the air. Reinforcements. Their extraction. Syrinx stood next to Jack, watching the sky. For the first time in her life, she wasn't standing with her kind. She was standing with him. And it felt right. The ultimate fight and human endurance. The extraction ship hovered above the landing pad, its engines roaring, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. The reinforced ramp extended downward, a beacon of escape from the blood-soaked betrayal they had just survived. Syrinx could feel the ache in her body, the sting of her wounds, the deep exhaustion creeping into her muscles. But she ignored it. She had survived worse. Beside her, Jack Carter was wiping his blade clean against his sleeve, his expression unreadable. His movements were controlled, efficient, the movements of a soldier who had been fighting his whole life. Syrinx had fought many battles, but never like this, and never beside a human like him. But their fight wasn't over. The reinforced door to the outpost slammed open. Heavy, armored boots hit the metal ground. Syrinx turned, and her stomach tightened. It was one of the creatures, but this one was different. Taller, heavier. Its armor gleamed under the dim emergency lights, reinforced with strange, pulsing energy. Its glowing red eyes locked onto her, filled with something more than hunger. Intelligence, awareness, recognition. Syrinx knew immediately. This wasn't just one of the beasts. This was their leader. The final battle begins. The creature moved first. Fast. Faster than anything Syrinx had ever fought. It closed the distance between them in a second, its massive claws slicing through the air. Syrinx barely dodged. The air screamed as the claw ripped through the metal wall behind her like paper. Jack was already moving. He raised his pistol, fired 3 quick shots. Direct hits to the head. The bullets bounced off. The creature's reinforced armor absorbed them with no damage. Syrinx's mind raced. It's adapted. It's learning. Jack didn't hesitate. He tossed his empty pistol aside and drew his knife. Syrinx's eyes widened. A knife. Against that. This human was insane. But before she could stop him, Jack charged. The human refuses to fall. Jack dodged left just as the creature swiped at him. The force of the attack cracked the floor. But Jack was already moving. He slid low underneath its reach and drove his knife into its exposed joint. The blade sank in. The creature roared, whipping around with terrifying speed. It backhanded Jack across the platform. Syrinx heard the sickening crack of his body slamming into the metal wall. She expected him to stay down. He didn't. Jack staggered back up, coughing blood. His left arm hung at an awkward angle, dislocated or broken. But his grip on his knife never loosened. Syrinx's stomach twisted. How was he still standing? Jack wiped the blood from his mouth and smirked. That all you got? The creature snarled, its massive frame shifting as it prepared to strike again. Syrinx couldn't wait anymore. She launched herself forward, fighting like a human. Syrinx had always relied on brute strength. But brute strength wasn't enough anymore. Jack had taught her that. This wasn't about overpowering her enemy. This was about outlasting it. Surviving. She ducked under the creature's claws, staying just out of reach. She used its own momentum against it, sidestepping just before impact. Jack was already beside her, moving in tandem. He was fighting with her now, not ahead of her. She caught his eye for the briefest second, and she understood. He wasn't telling her what to do anymore. He was trusting her to know. Syrinx growled and darted forward. She aimed for the joint Jack had already injured, slamming her claws into the weak point. The creature howled. Jack followed immediately. He twisted, using his good arm to drive his knife deeper. The beast staggered, its movements slowing. Syrinx felt it. The shift. The battle was turning. Jack saw it too. Now. Syrinx didn't hesitate. She grabbed the creature's massive head, using all of her weight to slam it down. Jack leaped onto its back, his knife flashing. One final strike. Straight through its skull. The beast shuddered, then collapsed. Silence. Then the distant roar of the extraction ship's engines. They had won. They had survived. Together. The aftermath. Syrinx stood over the corpse, her breathing ragged. Her entire body ached. Her wounds burned, but she was alive. Beside her, Jack was leaning against the wall, his breath shallow. His arm was still broken, his body battered. But his expression was the same. Calm. unshaken. Syrinx narrowed her eyes. "You're insane." Jack smirked. "Took you this long to figure that out?" Syrinx let out a sharp breath, almost a laugh. The extraction ship hovered lower. A voice crackled over the comms. "We see you." Preparing to land. Jack glanced at her. "You coming?" Syrinx hesitated. For the first time, she wasn't sure where she belonged. She looked down at the fallen creature, then at the outpost, where her own kind had betrayed her. Then at Jack, the human who had fought beside her, the human who had never abandoned her. Syrinx exhaled and cracked her knuckles. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." Jack grinned. As they stepped toward the ship, Syrinx didn't look back. Her old life was gone. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The respect and submission. The extraction ship's ramp lowered with a metallic hiss, its engines humming as the dust around them swirled in the turbulence. The darkened sky above was vast and silent, a sharp contrast to the battle that had just unfolded below. Syrinx felt the weight of everything pressing on her. Her wounds, her exhaustion, her decision. She was leaving. Leaving behind her people. Leaving behind everything she had been raised to believe. She wasn't sure if it was betrayal or liberation. Jack Carter, standing beside her with his broken arm and bloodied face, didn't seem to care about the weight of the moment. He just tilted his head toward the ship. "You coming or what?" Syrinx exhaled, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. She had made her choice. She wasn't a Dravani warrior anymore. She was something else. Something stronger. The return. The ship's interior was dimly lit, its metallic walls lined with combat gear and emergency medical kits. The last surviving soldiers, just a handful, were slumped in the seats, bandaging their wounds. Syrinx caught a few wary glances from them. She wasn't one of them. Not yet. She ignored the looks and dropped into a seat, wincing as the pain from her injuries flared up. Across from her, Jack was letting a medic pop his shoulder back into place. "Cracky." Jack grunted, but didn't flinch. Syrinx frowned. "You don't even feel that." Jack rolled his shoulder, testing it. "Pain is just a problem to solve." Syrinx shook her head. "You humans are insane." Jack smirked. "Yeah, and you just chose to stay with us. What does that make you?" Syrinx didn't have an answer. The ship jolted as it exited the planet's atmosphere. The darkness of space stretched out before them. The battle was behind them. The future was unknown. The confrontation. When they landed on the human flagship, Syrinx expected hostility. Suspicion. What she didn't expect was silence. As she stepped off the ship, every human soldier on the deck stared at her. Some reached for their weapons. Others simply watched, waiting. She had been their enemy. Now she was standing beside one of their own. Jack didn't hesitate. He walked ahead, his uniform stained with blood and dust, his body bruised but unbroken. He walked with purpose. And Syrinx followed. Through the metallic corridors, past soldiers whispering behind their backs, past officers who narrowed their eyes in disapproval. They reached the command room. The doors slid open with a heavy clunk. Inside, high-ranking officers and strategists gathered around holographic displays. Their conversations halted the moment Syrinx stepped inside. A tall man in decorated combat armor turned. His sharp eyes flickered between Jack and Syrinx. General Callahan, the man in charge. He crossed his arms. "Carter, what the hell is this?" Jack didn't blink. "Survivor." Callahan scoffed. "She's the enemy." Jack shook his head. "Not anymore." Syrinx felt the tension in the room, the weight of 1,000 unspoken doubts, fears, and distrust. Callahan stepped closer, towering over her. "Why should we let you stay?" Syrinx met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I earned it." The room went silent. Callahan studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Jack. "This is your responsibility now." Jack nodded. "It was always my responsibility." Callahan exhaled sharply and gestured toward her. Then make her understand how we do things here. Syrex's jaw tightened. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Acceptance. Respect. No. Not yet. She would have to fight for it. And she would. The final test. Later, after the debriefings, after the medical checks, Jack took her to a private training bay. Just the two of them. Syrex rolled her shoulders, still sore but eager. What is this? Jack tossed a combat knife onto the mat between them. A lesson. Syrex smirked. Are we doing this again? Jack simply picked up his own knife. Last time, you fought like a Dravani. Let's see if you learned anything. Syrex's smirk faded. This wasn't about dominance anymore. It wasn't about proving herself. This was something else. A test, a challenge, a new beginning. She grabbed the knife. No words. Just the sound of steel slicing through air. The respect and submission. The fight was brutal, but different from before. Syrex wasn't reckless. She didn't rely on brute strength. She moved like Jack had taught her. She adapted. She endured. The match lasted longer than any of their previous fights. But in the end, Jack still won. He knocked her to the mat, pinning her with one knee. The knife pressed against her throat. But this time, Syrex didn't feel humiliated. She felt acknowledged. Jack pulled back and stood, offering his hand. This time, she took it without hesitation. He smirked. Now you're getting it. Syrex exhaled, a smirk of her own forming. You're still insufferable. Jack shrugged. Get used to it. She already had. As she stood beside him, bruised but standing tall, she realized something. She had not been defeated. She had been reborn. Not as a Dravani warrior, not as an enemy, but as something else entirely. A warrior of her own making. And for the first time, she wasn't alone.